In this video, we're going to look at an overview of the respiratory system. So I want to start with a couple of key terms. So number one, ventilation means to move air in and out of our lungs. Inspiration is when we're moving air in. Exhalation is moving the air out. And respiration is when we move the oxygen from the lung tissue into our bloodstream. And then we also have cellular respiration, and that is when our cells take up the oxygen and use it to make energy, which is ATP. Okay, now let's have a look at some of the structures. We have upper respiratory structures and lower respiratory structures. So up here we can see the upper respiratory structures. We have the nostrils bringing air into the nasal cavity, and then we can bring air in through our mouth or the oral cavity. And it connects here through the structure called the pharynx. When we swallow food, that also goes through the pharynx. And this is one reason why when you're eating food, and if you laugh, you can push food up into your nose, or you can push liquids or something that you're drinking. So when we start moving down here into the larynx, this is where it is our voice box, and this is only part of the respiratory system. So when we swallow food, it goes through the pharynx and down through the esophagus, which is behind the trachea. And the trachea is surrounded by cartilage that makes it a very sturdy, strong structure so that our airway never collapses and we can always freely move air in and out of the respiratory system. The lower respiratory structures includes the trachea and then the bronchi that branch off, and then all of the smaller bronchioles until we get into the lung tissue. And we'll zoom into that in a second. I also want to point out here the diaphragm. This is a muscle that will move up and down to bring air in and out of the lungs. I will have a more detailed video on ventilation processes, but when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and it moves down, and that creates a negative pressure in the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity, and it causes air to move in. And then when we breathe out, the diaphragm will relax and push back up. That will increase the pressure and that will move the air out. So let's have a look at the functions of the respiratory system. So some of them are obvious. We're going to be inhaling oxygen so that we can move oxygen into our blood cells and then our cells can use it to make energy. We will also exhale carbon dioxide and we exhale other waste products. The respiratory system also warms and moistens the air. So when we breathe in through our nose, it goes through structures and cilia, and there's mucus that will help to moisten the air. When we exhale, we actually exhale a fair amount of water. So especially if you're living in a drier climate, then you're going to need to drink a little bit more water to make up for the water that we exhale. Another function of the respiratory system that we sometimes don't think about is how it regulates our blood pH. Carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product when we make energy. When we use oxygen, make ATP, carbon dioxide becomes a waste product and we exhale that. Now, when the carbon dioxide is traveling through the bloodstream, it acts as an acid. It has an impact on our blood pH because carbon dioxide will combine with water with an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And it will create carbonic acid, and then we have our bicarbonate buffer system. This will also be discussed in more detail in another video. But carbon dioxide makes our blood pH decrease, which makes it more acidic. So when you breathe more and you exhale more carbon dioxide, that's going to increase your blood pH. Whereas if you hold your breath, and carbon dioxide builds up in your blood pH will go down and become more acidic. The other functions of the respiratory system is to produce vocal sounds. As we move air through the voice box in the larynx, we can produce different sounds, and different people have different sounds based on the size of the vocal cords, the size of the opening, the shape of your mouth, all kinds of things impact how our voice sounds. Our respiratory system will also filter air particles. So when we breathe in through our sinuses and we use those cilia and the mucus, that will also trap particles, and then we can sneeze or blow our nose and we can get rid of those, and we don't get them all the way into our respiratory system. We do have immune cells, though, in our lungs that will clean up dust and debris and things that we breathe in. We're constantly breathing in different particles from the atmosphere. And then lastly, we use the respiratory system as our sense of smell. So as we move air in through the sinuses, we have lots of different olfactory receptors that will detect different kinds of scents. Now let's look over here at this diagram, focusing on the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Starting up here with the trachea, air is moving in from the upper respiratory structures down into the trachea and the bronchi and then the bronchioles. Now, these structures are conducting structures, meaning they don't allow for gas exchange. They just allow for the movement of air to get to the smaller structures. Down in the smaller structures, we call those the respiratory structures or the respiratory zone, because we can have gas exchange in these structures. So the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli or the alveolar sacs, we can move oxygen across these membranes into the bloodstream. Now I want to look at a diagram, and it has tons of labels, but there's a few things that I want to point out specifically, and then you can just look at the labels to see what the different structures are. So some things that I want to point out. When we look at the nasal cavity, we have the different superior, middle, inferior nasal concha. So this is where we increase the surface area inside the nasal cavity so that we can warm and moisten the air. There's cilia in here and there's mucus in here. So the air goes in through the nose or through the mouth. When we look at this structure here, this is the uvula. This is the little thing you see hanging at the back of your mouth. So when you breathe in air, this is just relaxed. Air can come in through the nose or the mouth together, or if you're breathing through your nose, usually your tongue is kind of blocking the oral path, but we can move air both ways. But now let's suppose you're going to eat food. When you swallow food, your tongue here is going to push back, and this uvula is going to move up, and it's going to block this space so that food doesn't go up into your sinus cavities, except, of course, if you're laughing, right? So this is the function of your uvula. Now, if we move down a little bit, we have the oropharynx, because food can move through here as well as air. And now down here, we have our esophagus is behind the trachea. So the trachea is covered with cartilage, and it keeps this trachea open, whereas your esophagus will flatten when you're not swallowing food. And then when you swallow food, it will expand to accommodate the food that you've just swallowed. Now, how do we prevent food from going down into the respiratory system? We have an epiglottis. So the epiglottis, when we swallow food, this will move down and it will cover the opening to the trachea so that food can't go into the trachea, and it will go down into the esophagus. And then the larynx, this is where we have our vocal cords. And here is a cool picture of what your vocal cords look like. So if you took a picture looking down into your larynx, then this is what you would see. So the vocal cords surround the opening to the larynx. Now, the last part of the anatomy that I want to talk about in this overview is looking at the pleura. So we have membranes that surround the lungs and that also surround the thoracic cavity. And then in between those two pleural membranes is a space filled with fluid, pleural fluid, so that reduces the friction every time we inhale and exhale so that the lungs can expand and contract without causing any pain. So if we zoom into a section of the lungs and just looking at the pleura that surround it, we have a visceral pleura that surrounds the lungs. Viscera means organs. And then on the outside, that is covering the inside of the thoracic cavity, that is our parietal pleura. And then in between there, filled with fluid, is our pleural cavity. So I actually have one more thing to say. So I wanted to talk about the pleura, but now I also actually want to zoom in and just look at what the alveoli look like. So this is where the oxygen is going to be moving from the alveolar sacs into the blood vessels. And when you look at this diagram, you'll see how many blood vessels are surrounding the alveoli, because we need to be able to move a lot of oxygen from the inside of those respiratory structures into the bloodstream so that we have enough oxygen in the blood for our cells to use to make energy. So if we took a little tiny section of our lung tissue and we magnified that and looked at it, I want you to see here, when we look at our bronchioles, we have smooth muscles here that surround these structures, so that if these muscles contract, it will constrict those airways and less oxygen air will be able to move through. And when these muscles relax, it will dilate these bronchial tubes, and then you can have more air going through. So an example of when that would happen, if you're exercising or you're having a fight or flight response, you're going to need to get more air into your body. So what you will do is dilate your bronchial tubes so that you can get more air in. So the fight or flight, or the sympathetic nervous system, can control those smooth muscles. And then we can see that our alveolar sacs kind of look like a bundle of grapes. And over here, you can see how much they are surrounded by blood vessels and also lymphatic vessels, so that we can pull any extra fluid out of this tissue and into the lymphatic system to be drained back into the circulatory system. And then if we zoom in to one single alveolus, then inside we have a couple of different cell types. So number one, we have macrophages. And I mentioned earlier that when we do breathe in dust and particles, we have immune cells that will help clean that up. And these macrophages are continually crawling around the inside of our lung tissue, acting kind of like little Roombas, to help get rid of any dust particles that we've inhaled. They will also get rid of dead cells. And then we have type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cells, these are endothelial cells where gas exchange occurs, and oxygen will move across these membranes to get into the red blood cells, and carbon dioxide will leave the red blood cells or the plasma and move into the lung tissue. Whereas type 2 alveolar cells are important for producing surfactant. So up here you can see oxygen is going to be diffusing from this alveolus into the red blood cells, and carbon dioxide, which we'll talk about in the other video as well, how we transport carbon dioxide. Some of it will be with red blood cells, but some of it will be in the plasma. And this moves across the membranes of the type 1 alveolar cells. Now, the type 2 alveolar cells that produce the surfactant, these are important because If you think about the surface tension of a water molecule, just think about a drip of water and how they hold together. And that's because of the polarity of water. There's positive and negative charges that make water want to come together. And because the tissue in our alveoli is so thin, it when we have that little layer of water, which we need to dissolve the oxygen, that would make the lung tissue collapse. So we have this surfactant substance, which is a little bit like soap, where it's amphipathic in the sense that it has uncharged regions as well. So it's kind of like an oil, and it helps to prevent or reduce that surface tension that happens in the lungs because of water being charged. So we need to have surfactant to keep the lungs open and clear and not from collapsing, and it helps us to diffuse oxygen.